Okay, so that was an overview. There's nothing there that we won't be covering in more detail today, but at the end of the video, I'll do another overview. I'll just repeat what we just did so we can summarize and just have it for the video. So thanks again for pointing it out, and let's go back to the first part of today's lesson. So we are talking about lambdas, and this first README is just another general overview that talks about some of the benefits of lambdas. So we already talked about how lambdas in JavaScript are essentially just anonymous functions. They utilize a syntax with values on the left, an expression on the left, and an output on the right. And when we call a Lambda inside of AWS, as in the resource itself, we're able to essentially spin up an environment, a very lightweight environment for this code to run. So it's cost effective, right? Like that's one of the first key benefits of it. We talked about how you could have APIs set up inside of an EC2 being served by something like Flask or Django. And when that's configured correctly, you will have public facing endpoints that you can send requests to. And that will essentially do the same thing that we'll be doing today with the Lambda, which is running some code and then as a result, manipulating a database. Again, the difference is, though, costs. When you're running Flask or Django on EC2 to support a range of APIs and API endpoints that you've written, you will be incurring the costs associated with an EC2. Whereas with a Lambda, you're only paying for the number of times it is used. So there's no overhead of an persisting environment when you're working with Lambdas. There is automatic scaling. The cloud provider, in this case AWS, will automatically scale the infrastructure to meet the demands of the app. So if you have more and more and more requests than you, I don't know, anticipated, you don't have to worry about setting up a load balancer like you would with an EC2 because the Lambda resource is already designed to handle that. And it gives you flexibility. It's very low maintenance. It's all sort of in line with cost efficacy, right? You're not just reducing cost in terms of money, but you're also reducing cost in terms of time. And that allows for better resource allocation, better security, because a lot of this is being handled by AWS. There's less room for error if there's less for the end user to configure. And again, it's event driven. I think a few weeks ago we talked about microservices versus monoliths. This is Lambdas are a very appealing option for microservice styled systems and applications. Okay, so key concepts of a Lambda. We talked about the Lambda function. So essentially at the core of what a Lambda is some code. In this case, our Lambda function is in Python, and we are passing in some necessary environment variables and values used to connect to MySQL. And then we define the Lambda, the function itself, which we call Lambda handler in this case. It could be called whatever you want. We're calling it Lambda handler. Um, this will grab values, columns and values from an event or a payload. In this case, that again looks like this right here. One of the cool things about the AWS Lambda resource and the UI is how it's got like this environment that's essentially VS Code in your browser, and it's got some A, it's simple. B, it's got everything you need, like even this little section for running tests, right? And this might be the other window because I think we did update this. Let me close that. If I click on edit again, we'll see that we were able to add this to our database. And for the next time we demo this, we'll change these values and we can hit save. What else? Let's see. So just like you see in VS Code, there's a file structure here. But what about requirements, right? We require PyMySQL, which doesn't come pre-installed on this Python image that we're using. So we'll have to walk through how to get that set up, and we'll go through two different ways of doing that. But that's, let's see, the functional aspect of a Lambda. The trigger or the event that triggers it, yeah, we can automate the execution of this by connecting the endpoint to some kind of external event, right? I don't think our lab today covers this. But like some simple examples is you could have a button in a UI that when clicked on by a user, that's a mouse click event in their browser, which then runs some code that sends a request from their client, the browser, to the Lambda endpoint. And that's going to trigger the logic inside of this script. And the resulting output in this case is this. So the front end application in this case will be written and designed to send this payload. Basically, there just has to be a match between the payload that gets sent out by the client and the payload that's expected by the server. I know we don't really cover APIs and requests as much as the full stack class does, but the basic principle is there. So we'll mostly be working with existing code that you'll just copy and paste. But you're definitely welcome to take a stab at writing additional logic and doing some more complex lambdas.
Julius,
Yeah,
can I ask a question about the lambdas?
sure.
Can they be written in other languages than Python?
Yes, yes, they can. You'll have all sorts of options, and we'll see that when we run through. I think we're about to run through right now, actually. I think this is a very, yeah, it's a very short
Okay.
page.
It
Yes,
kind of
what?
looks like a script. Kind of looks like a script that you import all of your dependencies into. And then once you have all the information in that script, it kind of, like you were saying, packages up you call it payload, but packages up what you want to send. If your port is open on your RDS, right, and it's configured to connect to the appropriate RDS, you should be able to send the information, and if your credentials are correct, it should respond and something like that. Does that sound
Exactly.
about
Yes, yeah,
nice?
sounds about right. So depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish, you just have to, yeah, write the same functionality you would as you would on your local machine if you were developing an endpoint. Okay, so now that we've talked about lambdas very broadly, let's actually dive into creating them. But let me ask you first, you've already created RDS databases, so you all should remember how to do this. So get your VS Code and browser windows open. sorry, give me one sec. VS Code isn't going to be as critical. Sorry, delivery. What was I saying? Yeah, VS Code isn't going to be as critical because as we saw here, we will be writing the code inside of a browser, but we'll still be using VS Code to create the layers for the libraries that our application is going to require. So let's have all that set up. And with our browser, we're going to go back into RDS and make an RDS. And if, hold on, let me check the chat. If we, I'm thinking, do we really all need to make RDS tables? You've already worked with RDS. Let's say it's optional. There's already an existing RDS table. Feel free to use that. Just make sure, or I said table, I meant an RDS resource. Just make sure you create um, your own database and table within that. But we're going to walk through how to create it anyway. So if you want to try to create on your own, we're going to do that right now. All right. So step one, setting up an RDS database with a table. So we go over to RDS inside of our browser, and when we create a new database, we will get to choose from certain things, right? So in this case, we're going to select MySQL. We can leave a lot of this as default, like having filters hidden and having this engine um, at the default. And we will want to choose the free tier when we get to the templates because we're not really going to be doing too much with this database anyway. So go ahead and create your database identifier, name it whatever you want. And this is important because as you saw in the code, we were specifying things like database name, username, password. It's going to match, all of that is going to match what we're setting up here right now, right? So I'm going to set my username to admin, and I'm just going to leave this at self-managed because we don't need to do any kind of complex secret management right now. We're just trying to play around with RDS and Lambdas. So I'm gonna give it a basic password as well, which is just a password. It's gonna complain about my password being weak, but we don't care. And we can leave it at this default instance. We could leave the storage values at default as well. It's not really gonna matter, but we could also disable storage auto scaling. Doesn't matter because we're not going to be filling up 20 gigabytes worth of storage in one afternoon. Do not connect to an EC2 resource because we're working with Lambdas. We don't need EC2s. We want to definitely enable public access so we can hit this endpoint externally. And we'll just use the default VPC. Now, when it comes to our security group, I do believe the default should have the correct inbound rules. And we'll double check that too, so we could see what that looks like. Availability zone can also be left at no preference. And inside of additional configuration, we'll leave it at its default value, 3306. But I want you to see here that we had to expand this section to see that, right? Because we're going to need this number when we connect to the database itself. So if you forget the default for port used for MySQL, this is one place that you could look for that. Or if you were to switch to any other kind of database, right? That section is what would show you the default port number used by that database management system. Okay, initial database name. I am going to name mine demo for EB2. All this remains the same. You don't really need backups. Doesn't want. Oh, this is the initial database name. If you leave this blank, it's not going to create an initial database. So yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. We already named our database up here, right? Where did we do that? Oh, I thought we did. Oh, yeah, here. The instance identifier. So yeah, we've already given it a name, and I just realized I kind of want to update that to that. And so this here is going to be a database name. I'm going to name mine names because as you saw in the test events and the code, I'm just passing in a first name and a last name. So this is going to be a names table that we're going to try to hit. Of course, you can name it whatever you want. You could try to go for a more complex schema and play around with that, but we'll just leave it at this for the demonstration. Okay, all of the rest of this can stay the same. And once we've looked through all of that, we are good to go. We can create the database. Okay, so now we got two databases up. I keep saying databases. I really mean like RDS resources, right? Because you can have multiple databases inside of this RDS because what this RDS is actually doing is it's running a database system in itself, like in this case, MySQL. And inside of MySQL, we could have multiple databases. So that is kind of setting up the RDS. Is there anyone that's not set up with an RDS, or are we all good to go? Okay. So now we can try connecting. And before we do that, I'm going to click on this. Inside of your database, you'll find, ooh, did I forget to select? I might have forgotten to select making it public. Can I go back and see that?
I think it's just because it's still creating.
Oh, is it? Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, while we're waiting on that, I'm gonna look at the first example from earlier. Once it's created, there's gonna be an endpoint, and you're gonna want to grab that endpoint. We're gonna need it. So let's copy that. Well, I guess you can't copy it because it's still creating for all of us. It might take a while too. But we can let's just copy the endpoint for this RDS for now, if yours hasn't created yet. And with this, we are going to go back to VS Code, wherever VS Code is. And we would connect by passing in that endpoint. So just as we see in the README, let's actually bring back that README. We're passing in the endpoint as an argument to the -H option, and we're using a capital P to specify our port number. We then specify our username with a -U, and this -P here, actually, don't let this trip you up. It's actually an option for requesting a password. So one interesting thing about MySQL, if you didn't run into this last time, is, or if you don't remember, is it's going to want you to pass in your password as a response to a prompt. So this last thing is actually a database name, not the password. Don't try to pass in your actual password. So knowing that, I can just connect with this command alone, and then it will prompt me for my password. And if I were to escape and type in a specific database, which I think is called DB demos, demo singular, demo DB. Then it lets me sign in. So once you're connected to one of these databases, we can go ahead and move on. Some of these steps say to create a database. So again, your mileage will vary. If you're working with your own RDS, you're going to want to create a database. You're going to want to create a table. We could use commands like show to see what already exists. So show tables. This shows us that we've got these two tables inside of our demo underscore DB. We could switch to other tables using use. So if you're not already connected to a table, you can use along with a database name. So let's say MySQL. And now if I do show tables, we see that I've got different tables because I'm in a different database, right? But I'm going to go back to the database I want. And what else? We could create a new table just to see what that looks like. Mhm. So let's make, I don't know, what should we make? Let's make, ooh, I cannot think on the spot right now. I have no idea what kind of table to make. We have users, we have names. I have no idea. I'm just gonna make desserts. So we're gonna have a desserts table. So we're gonna have things like cookies and cupcakes. There's gonna be names, and then there's gonna be calories. We'll leave it at no, yeah, we'll change it to int. No, we'll leave it at point char. It doesn't really matter. This is just silly. It's just for demonstration purposes. So let's paste that. Once I've created my table, I can do show tables again. And now I see that my table has been created. So now, what do we want to do next? Oh, yeah, now we're essentially ready to write our lambdas. Okay, so we are going to use some boilerplate code. We're importing a necessary library here, PyMySQL. This is so that we could interact with a MySQL client. We're importing with JSON, or sorry, we're importing JSON so that we could work with JSON. And we are also specifying the exact same things that you used when you were connecting through your terminal. So your endpoint, your username, your password, and the database name. Then we're going to define our actual function, and we're going to add some code. So let's actually go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and make a new function. I'm going to call it demo lambda 2. And like you were asking, Damon, what languages can we use? These are what are currently supported within AWS. So we could use Python, we could use Ruby, Java, C Sharp, use whichever you prefer or whatever you'll need to use in your final projects to work with whatever app you've built. And for now, for this demo, we're gonna go back to Python. Okay, this will just be at its default value. Permissions will give you three options. So you have a basic role, or well, a new role with basic Lambda permissions. You could use an existing role, which was created earlier with the first demo. So we could select this as well. And you could also just manually select those necessary policies through this third option, but we don't want to do that. We're just going to go ahead and use either the first or second option. If you do the first, then just try to remember to delete the role later. I know we have a lot of roles and stuff that could probably get deleted, so we'll need to purge some of these, but we could also select this one. This is the one that was created earlier. This should have everything that we need. And under additional configurations, we want to check enable function URL because we want AWS to give us a URL to hit. You don't have to do this because if you wanted to have a more robust system for handling your various APIs, you would use something like API Gateway. But for something a little lighter, right, like maybe like a helper function or something along those lines, a function URL will be sufficient. So this is going to be a URL that's generated by AWS, and we'll hit that with a curl command later on. Okay, so we want to select. I think we can change this later. I'm going to select none. And it's talking about creating a policy, which is fine. And the rest of this can be left as is. Invoke mode will be buffered. It's just the default. The invocation results are available when the payload is complete. There's a max payload size. We're not gonna be exceeding that with just a simple 3-line key value pair object. So we'll leave all of that as is, and we can go ahead and create. Okay. How's everyone doing so far?
So I have a question, Julius.
Sure.
You said the Lambda functions will use it in our projects. Does every project need a Lambda function? Like this is necessary?
No, it's not necessary. Trying to think through the assessments. Yeah, you'll be working with a full stack application that's already been pre-built, so it's not necessary to add any additional logic, which means it's not necessary to um, add like new endpoints or anything. It shouldn't be, unless you're trying to do like anything extra. Well, even then, that's not required, right? What's going to be required is setting up the infrastructure and pipeline to deploy your application. Now, I'm trying to think through the assessment and I'm trying to think if there is a Lambda used in any of them. Like there might be a use case.
I looked at the assessment if you go to in the curriculum and
Mhm.
you go to like what's being covered, it does not talk about lambdas, nor is it in the review section.
Okay, yeah, for assessment one, it's not gonna be there, right? Trying to think if it's not gonna be in assessment two either. Two is gonna be all Terraform. Uh, three is gonna be GitHub Actions. Four is Kubernetes. I think it might be in the fourth assessment, but it also might be what is called like a stretch goal. So it's just for bonus points to utilize a Lambda to, I don't even remember. It might have to do with monitoring. But Lambdas are still going to be important to know for certification. And right, even though it's not going to be in the test or the assessment, I should say, I think learning how to use them is still pretty vital because they're so useful, right? Like it's yes, it will be more handy if you were working on more development related tasks, but if you had to troubleshoot a Lambda for whatever reason, like if it started to fail, it helps to know how the Lambda is constructed so that you'll know how to navigate and look around.
Okay. Is there like a heuristic? Because there's so many tools. How do you know, okay, this will be a good use case for a Lambda?
I mean, that really just boils down to experience, right? So once you've been working in a lot of different contexts or environments, the more variety, right, like that you experience yourself, the more you'll be able to see like what works in one situation versus another. So again, thinking about like microservices and monoliths, because these fundamental properties help to act as heuristics as well, right? They may not be like direct heuristics, but if we know that in design theory for an application, your application is going to fall somewhere between a monolith and a microservice system, then you'll at least have an idea of which side you're leaning towards more, right? And if you're designing a system that you want to be very modular, which means you could reuse those components, that logic, over and over and over in different cases, like basically give a function, give multiple applications access to running a function, then you'll want to use lambdas. Um, for lightweight tasks, right? Like helpers, for things that aren't necessarily like integrated into your application or embedded into your app very deeply, lambdas could serve a very fast and helpful use case. Let's see. Let me think about some of the lambdas we use at Innova. Okay, so right now, one of the projects I'm working on is writing a lambda to grab logs from CloudFront and send them to Splunk. Splunk is essentially a logging aggregation tool that companies can use to search through, to consolidate all sorts of logs from different applications and to be able to effectively and quickly search through them, right? And this is a different platform from something like Datadog, which is a monitoring and observability platform, or different from something like Astronomer, which is a batch running platform. It's designed to run instances of Airflow, which are used in CD pipelines, continuous development phase, to essentially run any necessary job or task um, that an application might need, right? Uh, Build pipelines is a common use case when your application is deploying new changes. It's going to hit a point in a pipeline where it triggers the run of an Airflow job, which will spin up an environment for it to um, run the build logic in, and then it will just send that build on its merry way. That's Astronomer. So that's what we're doing. We're taking logs from Astronomer, sending them to CloudFront, and then sending them to Splunk for compliance purposes, because we can use Splunk to track, not to track, to hold logs almost indefinitely as well, right? Um, at a much cheaper cost than if we were to just have these logs stored in AWS, for example. Plus, not all of our applications log in AWS. We have across the entire organization, yeah, several different products, which means several different applications. Yeah, Len?
So on the the microservice slash monolith discussion and all the tools, because you're naming off a lot of tools here. And
Mhm.
I was watching a video, I don't know, at some point, and the individual on there was like, you're almost always going to start out as a monolith, and then at some point you'll have a need because the team's so big to break up into a microservice,
Mhm.
right? And there's always trade-offs. And
Yeah.
so I'm just offering this to Mikhail and everybody. When I heard that, I'm like, you know what? Everything I do is a monolith, probably small, and unless I go to an organization, right? And then at that point, the organization, I'll be the new guy, and they'll be teaching me how to use a system. When they say this is a Lambda function, I'll be like, ooh, let me look at that so I can try and figure it out because I don't know what the hell Lambda functions are. I mean, I kind of do, but I'm just saying, like, as an example, I'm not really getting too twisted about super understanding everything. It's more of the awareness. And like I said, it's a tool, right? You got to be aware of it. So when you see it, you know what it is, and you can look at it, and you know how to like dig it out and maybe unravel the Christmas lights or whatever.
Mhm.
But I don't think we're gonna know everything in this class.
So Julia, Splunk is like a security tool, right? So it has some features in it that allow you to store logs in a very consolidated and efficient way.
Yeah, because
Nice.
it aggregates logs from like so many sources, there's going to be a lot of logs and has like some mechanisms like freezing your logs, which is essentially just encrypting them so they take up less space and you could store them for longer, and then unfreezing them, which is just decrypting them and giving you
Nice.
access to them again.
It's an OG software too. I mean, Splunk's been around before the cloud.
Hmm. Hmm.
Freezing and defreezing kind of sounds like Glacier. So
Yeah.
do they have like some sort of just S3 bucket that they're storing all your logs in more than likely? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, actually. I don't know if any of our services use that. But yeah, that's a very good call up to Page. There's essentially that same kind of functionality there. Um, yeah, so sorry, I feel like I just went on a tangent, but to go back to the original question of like when you know when to use what, it's a very intuitive thing, right? That just comes from experience. It's real hard to try to like logically explain and provide an answer for that. It's very intuitive. Does that help, Mikhail?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Yeah, some other like I don't know, thoughts for quick use cases for Lambdas. I mean, even if like even in a development setting, right? It's faster to play around with a Lambda than to set up an entire application, get that application deployed and running just so you could interact with an API endpoint, right? Like let's say you had an idea that you wanted to, I don't know, build what are those called? Like tools like Monday, Jira, um efficient productivity tool. Let's say you wanted to build a productivity tool and you wanted to like be able to record everything that you do throughout the day. So you hop onto your computer to sign into a class at Platoon. That's something that you want to log, right? You could write a shortcut on an iPhone that sends a request to a Lambda that then updates a database, and then you have that data like all inside one database. And you don't have to build a whole application and have Django or Flask or anything like that running, right? Lambda is good for because it's lightweight, it's great for experimentation, development, exploration, things like that. So those are some additional use cases.
Oh, if I remember correctly, Lambdas have a maximum runtime of like 15 minutes. So if it goes beyond that time, it's not going to work anymore. So it's for very short, specific things that you're trying to do, and just quick functions you can run for whatever data it's being triggered from. It'll alter it for you, and then do a thing, and it
Mhm.
just kind of does a task. If I understand it correctly.
You are, and I appreciate that call out. So yes, that 15-minute time limit is actually a very good thing to point out because that can maybe help you gauge whether or not a Lambda is right for your functionality, right? Is the thing that you're trying to do so complicated that a 15-minute runtime isn't going to be enough, right? Like, does it have to open up a client and wait for and continue listening for that client and wait for the user to manually log out, right? That's in that kind of situation, you won't want to use a Lambda because otherwise you'll be limiting the user to 15-minute sessions. So yes, yeah, just be curious. The more that you play around with these things and experience them yourself, and the more scenarios that you'll find yourself in once you land a job, that's really where the learning is going to happen. That's really where it's going to stick. Like we could throw as much or as little information as you at you as we think is best, but all of that learning is really still going to come from within, right? It's going to come from within your own experiences. You have to apply everything that you hear from us in order to really solidify that learning. So while it may not be necessary for assessments, if you have the bandwidth, then go for the stretch goals and try out integrating a Lambda or something like that. Okay, feel like I have been on a soapbox, so I'm gonna step off and we're gonna continue with our lab. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of boilerplate code here. So things like importing a library and setting up our initial configuration, right? Let's go ahead and replace everything with that. We're gonna grab our RDS endpoint. We are gonna copy it into this first value. We're going to update our user. And for our password, if we want it to be a little more secure, we want to go down to environment variables and create an environment variable for it. Now, you could also do this for all of these values, which might be best practice. But for demonstration purposes, this is all we are going to do an environment variable for. And that's MySQL underscore password because we can use this to store a password.
Julius, you got that information all just from the RDS lecture, right?
Yeah, I think it all matches
Is that
now.
where you were? Is that where you
Yeah. This is
lesson? You're in the RDS lesson right now, right?
yeah, a 2 dash AWS underscore RDS. Okay. So right, we have our first part, which is specifying our necessary parameters. We're gonna go ahead and hit save. That's not necessary, so we're gonna hit save. And in our code, we're going to reference that environment variable. And I don't know if I actually updated that in here. No, I did not. Let me see. If we look at our first Lambda, you can see the right code here. Okay, cool. So we have to use OS in Python. So OS, I think it's for,
Julius, sorry, where did you update the environment variable for the RDS again? I missed that part.
oh, sure. If you go back to the left panel and scroll all the way down, you could add environment variable.
Oh, okay. Let's see
Mhm.
here.
And now in Python, the way that we grab them is we have to import OS, which allows us to navigate the file structure in the environment that this is all run in. And we are going to use, I'll add this to the README because I just realized it's not in the README. We're going to use password equals os dot environment or environ. And we're going to pull the MySQL password value. You're gonna want to match this with the key of your key value pair. And then the database name is, I think we used names earlier, so I'm gonna leave it at names. And oh, yeah, maybe the other thing that's not in the README. It says to now within your Lambda handler method, it kind of just jumps into that. You have to write the Python code for defining a method. So that's going to be def for define, and we're going to call it Lambda handler. And then he sets some parentheses and then colon, right? Because we want to take in the event and context. Does it actually say that in the README? Yeah, I'll add that. I'll add it right now. So we're going to define a new method, just like we saw here. And because we didn't really go over Python as much as we did in previous cohorts, and I'm guessing that's why the README is written this way to get folks to try to practice their Python. We'll just add it here right now. This is some markdown stuff, so don't worry about this, but we want to say def to define, and then our function name, which in this case is Lambda handler. And then just like in JavaScript, you're going to use parentheses to specify what kind of parameters it accepts. So in this case, we're going to need event context. From there, we could go ahead and start copying um, the code inside of the README. Okay, so we said we're going to add that. Shoot, someone remind me, was there something else I needed to add to the README? I think it was just this.
I believe you're going to add OS environment,
Ah, yes.
OS dot environment,
Thank you.
Viron.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Keep it a little more later. In the bottom, you will be able to add environment variables. And because we're using environment variables, we'll need to use a library to be able to read them in our code. So add import OS, and then an update password to this environment. Cool. Okie dokie. So Now we are ready to copy paste this part. And this part right here, if we just read this line by line, we're creating a variable called columns. And we are using some funky syntax here. We're setting a comma and a space. We're calling join, and then we're passing in the event keys. So basically, we're going to be creating a CSV row or line of these key values. We're then going to set a values template where we okay, how do I explain this? This values template is going to be what allows us to I can't remember if this is for the rows or the columns. This is going to allow us to either pass in multiple rows, or this is simply what's going to be iterating through the various columns. Um, but we don't really need to understand that too deeply. The code is there, it's provided, it works. This is essentially converting what we're passing in, the payload, right, into our SQL statement. So in MySQL, we have to type for our command, insert into our database name, names, the columns. We're passing in the columns because we have to specify what columns. If we were writing our query, we would be specifying what columns we want to be inserting values into. And then the values themselves is a comma separated string of the different values that we want to pass into the different columns. And I think this template has something to do with just ensuring that the values that you pass in go to the right column. So that's going to look something like if we go back to our, oh, this one doesn't have the test. If you go back to our test and look at the payload, right, it's basically taking all of the keys for that first part of the argument, columns equals join event dot keys. So this is telling us, or this is telling MySQL specifically that we want to use these columns. And then we pass in the values, which are the values to these keys. And that will also be joined into a CSV row. Okay. Now that we have some code that can handle the payload, and basically, right, this code here is going to be where you write whatever you need to write to handle whatever kind of payload you're trying to accept or like work with or manipulate. And once we have that, we can start working on code for the request itself, for handling the request itself. And we're going to do that using a try block so that we could have some error handling in place as well. Okay, so inside of our try block, we are setting up a connection, and this should all look familiar. We are using PyMySQL, which we've imported, and we are going to use its connect method, passing in these arguments, the host or endpoint, username, password, database name, and connection timeout. Notice the PASSWD here. That's unique to, well, not really unique, but that's how PyMySQL wants to accept the password value. So don't try to fix that with an O and an R. Just leave it as is. And once we have our connection variable, we then call cursor, which is another built-in method inside of a PyMySQL. This is basically what establishes the connection. And if you kind of like imagine inside of like a virtual environment, well, not if you were to manually sign into like a virtual environment or like SSH, you would see a cursor, right? And that's going to tell you like where you're at within the terminal. This is the same thing essentially, but just not for a human, but for the program itself. And then we can call commit or close. Well, not or, we're going to call it both because once we commit the changes, we want to close the connection. Like Paige mentioned earlier, there's a 15-minute runtime limit to our Lambda. Lambdas are supposed to be single function anyway, right? So once we're done with handling the logic it's designed to handle, we can safely close out that connection. And then we'll either return a 200 response if it's successful, or an exception with a 500 response if it's not successful. And that's all we need for our code. Okay.
Just a quick question. So the indentation doesn't really matter here.
Oh, it does. It matters in Python. Python is indentation. It's picky about indentation. It's how, unlike languages like JavaScript, it's how Python knows to interpret.
Define scope.
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of what defines scope.
Yes. Yes.
So are the indentations here correct? We're supposed to happen?
Let me see. I think this try might be indented too much, maybe. Yeah, the try is indented too much. Yeah, that shouldn't be lining up with that. Now it's not indented enough. Oh, I think because I copy pasted these, they were like using double two spaces as an indent. Okay. I don't know why I did that this time, but not last time.
It happens to me all the time when I copy multiple lines. Like the first one will go, and then everything below it will not, or something like that. However it is, it's a common copy and paste issue.
Hmm. Yeah, so this first lambda should be a good point of reference if you need to double check how all the indentations should look. We have our return indented within our try block because try and accept have to be aligned. So this needs to go in one more time to line up with all of that. And same with that second return, that needs to be indented one more time. Okay, so this should be good. Once you're done, you could deploy your changes. If you don't deploy your changes, you're going to lose your changes. So deploy your changes. Okay, and it's going to update your function. It's going to confirm if it succeeded or not. And now, if we were to try this, it's going to fail. Should fail. So let's run our test and let's see why it's failing. Oh, let's write a test first. So once you're done with that, go to test events, hit plus. These keys need to match whatever the columns are in your table. So I think in my case, I was using ID, first name, and last name. And we're going to go ahead and save. It's going to ask for a name. And once you've saved your test, you could also just invoke it from up here. But once it's saved, you can just invoke it from this play button down here. And it's going to bring up your terminal and it's going to run some logic. And then it's going to give you some kind of error message. In this case, saying there's no module called PyMySQL because we never set up PyMySQL, and the version of Python that we selected when we were setting up this Lambda does not come with PyMySQL. So we can't use the terminal here, or at least I can't. I have not used a SAM CLI, so I'm just going to do this in VS Code. And there are two ways of doing it. I think we're kind of going over on time, so I'm just going to show the first way, which is through layers, and that that should be enough. So what are layers? Layers are essentially ways to extend the code base of your Lambda. The second method that we would have shown would have been to package the necessary libraries into your deployments. And so you'd be able to actually see those in here. Like in JavaScript, that would be node modules. In Python, there would be just libraries inside of a Python directory, I think. But layers are another way to do that. So what we could do is we could go to layers, hit edit, and oh, this UI is the worst. Don't hit edit, hit add a layer instead, and then look for this button here. You want to create a new layer, and it's just kind of like this really small URL in the info. So if we want to create a layer, we go to add a layer, and then we click on this link here. So now we can create a layer. You're probably just going to want to name it whatever library you're installing. So in this case, PyMySQL. And we have to upload a zip file. But how do we make that zip file? Inside of your VS Code. So directory, and we're gonna go ahead and create a directory called Python. This does need to be named Python so that when it gets zipped up and sent over to AWS Lambda as a zip file, AWS is going to know how to work with it. So let's now go into our Python directory. This is where we install the necessary libraries. In this case, it's just PyMySQL. So pip install PyMySQL. I'm just noticing too that the README is saying to use a virtual environment, which is best practice, but also not absolutely necessary. So if I were to do this without a virtual environment, I'm going to do my pip install PyMySQL. Oh, did I do it? I didn't do a virtual earlier today. Yeah, I didn't. That's weird. I didn't do a virtual environment earlier. Wondering what I ran. You know. Let's see. Did I do earlier? Okay, so I'm inside of my Python directory. I'm going to do a pip install MySQL, and I'm going to do a -t. And then I'm going to select this current working directory. So -t is for target. Because I forgot to pass in -t like a few minutes ago, it was warning me that it's already installed globally, and that's fine. But we want to install it locally so that we can zip it up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's going to install Oh, it's gonna install the right package if I type in the right package name, which is PyMySQL, and it installed successfully. So again, it's pip install PyMySQL-t, and the period symbol specifies current working directory. The alternative is the virtual environment. If you set up a virtual environment and you activate that virtual environment, it will run Python and pip install commands inside of that virtual environment. So both ways work. I'll update the README to include both. And now that I have zipped this up, or sorry, no, I'm zipping it up next. Now that I've created, I can zip it up. It's basically just the PyMySQL library. If we go in that directory, we'll be able to see all of the stuff that it comes with. And now it can be used inside of our Lambda through a layer. So I'm going to go back up one more directory and I'm going to run a zip command. And I am going to pass in this name. And then I'm going to specify that I want it inside of a directory called Python. I think because I'm already in a Python directory, I could just use the period symbol. So let me see. Well, no, let's just go ahead and select Python. And now we should see the PyMySQL layer zip. So that's what you want to upload here inside of the layer. I'm going to grab the zip file that you created. Okay. That you want to select the runtime. These are all optional. This is all informational. So this lets other engineers on your team know what runtime they need to be using in order to get this to work. And I think we used 3.13 earlier. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and create it. It saved it as version 3. I guess because it's the exact same thing as what I made earlier. And now, if we go back to our Lambda functions, my current Lambda. Now we could go to edit. Or sorry, still not edit. We go to add a layer. We could add a layer and select our custom layer. So I made PyMySQL. It's saved as version 3. I'm going to hit save, or I'm going to hit add. And now we could see the layer in here. So if I run this code one more time, I run the test. It takes 2 positional arguments, but 2 were given. Oh, right. Content and events, right? I think that was what we needed. Yeah, so basically, it needs to be able to handle these 2 arguments that are passed in by the request, but we forgot to specify in our function that it needs to take in those arguments. So I've added them. I need to deploy. Did I just deploy? I'll deploy again. No changes to deploy to save my changes, and then I'll hit play. And now it's telling me event is not defined. So it's probably event singular. Whoops. I'm going to deploy again. And now I'm going to run again. And it's telling me Lambda context object has no attribute keys. And that's happening inside of line 12. Okay, let me just double check what the other Lambda looks like. Oh, my parameters have to be in the opposite order. So first it wants the event, then it wants the context. All right. Third time is the charm. I'm going to deploy and I'm going to run again. And apparently we're using the wrong database name. So let's go back to MySQL. I think we were waiting on the what is it called? Oh wait, no, this is the endpoint from the first database. So that means, right, since it's the endpoint from the first database, I named that database DemoDB, I believe. All right, finally, fourth time is charm. So once all your code is good and you hit the test event, it should submit successfully. And now if we go back into our database, we do select from that same table, which was names. We've added a new line, which is matches what we have here. Let's see. I'm going to set this to 3. I'm just going to test this one more time. Test, save. And again, I could just invoke it from here too. But let's see. And it should still show inside of my terminal. And if I select statements, we see that it added my new row. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, Julius, on the part where you were zipping up the environment, I don't know if you should call it. How do I do that part? I was on that part of my VS Code and yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Basically, let's see.
So I'm in the Python directory. So I changed to the directory above it, right?
Yeah, you do.
Okay. And then what command am I supposed to run? Sorry.
It's a zip command. It is zip dash.
Zip dash R. Okay, I'll just see. Oh, nice.
Cool.
Okay. And then from there, we should be able to pull that into the layer.
Yes.
Okay.
Is anyone else running into any issues? We could do some live troubleshooting.
I wasn't able to connect to my RDS, but I was assuming that was just because of the security group.
Oh yeah, let's take a look at that.
Okay, so yeah, I'll pull this guy up. Let's see where my command was a little while ago. It just freezes up on here. Um, so I created my own RDS, and let me pull that up. So this is my endpoint.
Okay.
Copied it from here. I'm using port 3306. What else was there? Oh, the configuration. Actually, I think I can go here. Darn. There was one spot I forgot. where I can see my username and password, but it's pretty much this, just admin and then DevOps 2024. This is my database name.
Okay.
Am I missing something here?
No, that looks good to me. So
Okay.
I think your first intuition was probably correct about it being the security group. So let's take a look at that. Cool.
All right.
Yeah, let's click on that. And let's look at its inbound. Okay.
Was anybody else able to get into their RDS?
Yeah,
No.
I was.
Okay, that actually looks correct. You have 0.0.0.0.0 for port 3306. What else could it be? So if it's just hanging on the connection, your RDS, did you enable public connections? I forget actually how that was specifically worded.
I may have missed that. Let's see if I can. I don't know if I can edit it from here or if I have to redo it, which is fine too, more practice. But
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to redo it. You should just be able to modify it and change it to public.
Okay, let's try the modify button on top right. And let's scroll down until we find the public reference connectivity. Additional configuration, maybe.
oh, nice. Just that, right? Okay. Yeah, that's probably it. All right. I don't know if it needs to load or anything. Maybe not. This is still hung up. Let me try again. Something so simple as usual.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if it updated yet.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a while. You gotta wait for it to.
Oh
I'll
yeah.
try again in a second or something.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Cool. All right. Sorry that went over. Feels like we've been here a while. Let's open up breakout rooms. Let's go on a break. I'll be here in the main room, both Stephen and I, to answer questions, and we will meet back up at 9. Let's do 9:15, and let's just do like some short announcements for the next few weeks, like talking about like dates and stuff, because we're hitting the end of the year. There's going to be a bunch of holidays, and want to make sure we're all on the same page. Sound good?
Yep.
Sounds great.
So you said 9 or 9:15? I can't remember. Sorry, I just 9:15. Okay.
CST.
Central.